Yo, what's up guys, and welcome back to a new video. We've gotten loads of questions on stream about both Arms and Fury and how to deal more damage on both of them. So today we are going over some more advanced Arms Warrior concepts to min-max your DPS in Mythic Plus. Now if you are a new Arms Warrior, I would suggest you watch my basic Arms guide first, to which I will leave a link in the description down below. Now, I made sure to verify everything we go over in this guide with Arkham Tyros, the Warrior Theory Crafter, to make sure it is as accurate as possible. Now, as always, if this guide helps you and you like my content, make sure to leave a like, comment, and consider subscribing. And without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Starting off, we are going to talk a little bit about Dreadnaught, and more importantly, the positioning with it. Dreadnaught is a shockwave that will shoot out in a straight line from which target you hit with your overpower. This will deal damage to all the mobs standing behind it with a soft cap of 5 targets. This is one of your major sources of AoE DPS, especially after the buffs that we have seen to it. Now, to make the most out of Dreadnaught, we will have to take a look at our positioning, however. Whenever we engage a pack, we want to position ourselves so that we are hitting either ends of that pack and preferably have all the rest of the mobs standing directly behind it. Since Dreadnaught is a linear shockwave, we want to make sure that we hit as many mobs with it as possible. This means that you want to avoid at all cost of being in the middle of the pack facing outwards, but instead being on either side of it facing inwards. Now, secondly, there is some cool tech that we can talk about with Dreadnaught specifically. Whenever we use sweeping strikes, this will actually affect our Dreadnaught as well. Every hit of overpower that we do with sweeping strikes will also send out a second Dreadnaught from our secondary target as well, for full damage, which will also increase our damage significantly. Now, it is important to note that the path of Dreadnaught is a decently forgiving straight line. So even though this can greatly impact your DPS, make sure to not do it at the cost of potentially dying. Now for our second topic, we take a look at mortal striking versus cleaving, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. As soon as we engage a pack, we need to make a decision which ability to use. And there are quite some rules to this, which will result in the most DPS. Now, if we are strictly talking about DPS output, we want to cleave when there is 5 targets or more when we have sweeping strikes up, and if we don't have sweeping strikes up, we want to start cleaving when there is more than 3 mobs around. As soon as we don't hit those parameters to cleave, we will instead use Mortal Strike. However, for M+, it isn't always as black and white when it comes to these rules. Now there is a lot of variation depending on what mobs you are fighting, the HP pools of the mobs, and also if a certain mobs needs to die faster because it is a danger to the group. To talk a little bit more in depth on this very issue, I chose Ruby Life Pools to demonstrate this a little bit more in depth. Now, Ruby Life Pools is a dungeon that in theory should almost solely be cleaved. However, we already face an issue with this very concept at the demi-boss before the first boss. Now, in a lot of instances, people will pull mobs on top of this demi-boss, and these monsters that are pulled on top of this demi-boss are far less important to die, and they also have a lot less HP. And in instances like this, I do like to deviate from the priority list and instead use Mortal Strike. The passive cleave you will do and the other classes will do will finish off the less significant mobs while the priority mob dies faster. We have a similar case looking at the first boss as well when she calls out the little whelplings. In theory, we have plenty of targets to start cleaving rather than using Mortal Strike. But once again, these mobs are very insignificant and will die passively by the AoE output from things like Dreadnaught or just other classes, their passive AoE. In instances like this, it is very important to understand that you will do the most damage by cleaving, but it will also actively slow down your ki. This is what people refer to as padding, and it will only make it harder to time your ki. Moving on, I wanted to chat a little bit about making the most out of your opener and how our tier set has impacted it. Because of our tier set, we can get a direct increase in DPS in the form of more critical strike and raw damage for 6 seconds. Now, it is very important to track this, and there's various weak auras and other methods to do so. I will leave a link to my Discord where you can find all the weak auras I am using so you can import those too. Now, whenever we take a look at the sims, they will assume that the pack is already gathered and it will immediately proceed with the priority as if you are fighting target dummies. But in reality, it does take some time for the tank to set up the pool, in which we can already prepare some things in order to maximize our DPS output once it is gathered. First of all, we want to make sure that you have some rage available. To do this, you can either charge into the mob that the tank is focusing directly or letting out a few auto attacks. Now, it is important to remember, however, that you cannot use too much, otherwise you will rip aggro and you will most likely die. When the tank is pulling and has enough threat, you can already set up some bleeds with your Thunderclap, and right before moving on to sending out your major CDs, you want to get your tier set buff. The best way to get your tier set buff in AoE scenarios is to send out a Cleave. Cleave will also hit a lot of other targets, and only one of those has to crit in order for you to get your full value of your tier set. When your tier set buff is applied, you can just continue by using the basic rotation. Now, moving on, we want to chat a little bit about the alignment of our CDs. Since we are playing with both Anger Management and Uproar, we will disalign our Bladestorm and Thunderous Roar from our avatar. Now, this is not that big of a deal, but we do need to know how to properly use them in order to do the most DPS. So the general rule of thumb with proccing our tier set before our major CDs remains the same as we just talked about. We want to immediately after send our Warbreaker into a Thunderous Roar followed up by Bladestorm. Now, the reason we want to use Bladestorm last is because of the Hurricane buff. Now, whenever we use Bladestorm, we will stack up a buff up to 6 times that will increase our strength by 5% per stack, up to a total of 30%. To gain the most value out of our Thunderous Roar bleed, we want to use it before our Bladestorm, so it gets buffed the longest period of time by our Hurricane buff. For our next topic, I wanted to chat a little bit about the Legendary. Now, a lot of people have been asking where they should use their Legendary, and there is multiple right answers when it comes to this. If you want to maximize the DPS, you want to immediately send it on pool after thunderclapping and applying your Fyrak bleeds onto the targets. Now, what I usually like to do is to first send out all my CDs, making sure that I have bleeds upon all of the targets, and then whenever there is only one or a few mobs left that need to die faster than the rest, we can send our Legendary into those. But either way works just fine. For the maximum amount of DPS, you will want to send it before you send your cooldowns. Now, for our last topic, I wanted to talk a little bit about blue silken lining. There has been a lot of debate about embellishments and which ones should be best and why. Now, I've personally been asked about this a fair few amount of times on stream, and I wanted to shine a little bit of light on it, clarifying my position on it. Now, in theory, blue silken lining is the best embellishment available for arms warriors in both Mythic Plus and Raid because of all the nerfs to all the other embellishments. There is one big side note to this, however. Whenever we make use out of blue silken lining, it is very important to stay above 90% threshold as much as you can. And this doesn't come without certain challenges. Whenever we drop below the 90% HP threshold, you will lose the mastery buff and it will take a period of time to reapply. In most M+ dungeons in the current rotation, there is quite a chunk of unavoidable damage being thrown our way. And if you want to make the most use out of blue silken lining, you need to be very familiar with the dungeons and how to avoid as much damage as possible. Now, secondly, you could also use your defenses preemptively in order to not lose the buff, but once again, you will need a lot of dungeon knowledge in order to do so. Whenever we take a closer look on the embellishment, we will see that the uptime is mostly gained on bosses and more lost on trash. This is mostly due to bosses being a lot more scripted than trash packs are, and it is easier to preemptively use your defensives on. Now, as a final side note, if you choose to use blue silken lining as your embellishment, I would recommend you to get a weak aura to track the buff uptime, as you do not want to send your major CDs outside of this buff. Now, that will be all for this more advanced min-maxing Arms Warrior guide. Once again, if this guide has helped you, make sure to leave a like and a comment and consider subscribing. And as always, I hope to catch you in the next one.